Welcome to our first afternoon session of our second day of the Birds and Bees Festival. Um, I'm happy to introduce Resource Steward Chris Crabtree, and he'll bring us up to date on the exciting prairie reconstructions that are underway in Missouri state parks. These efforts are bringing back the natural beauty of the great state in an awesome undertaking that will be rewarding for us all. So without too much further ado, thank you very much for joining us, Chris. I appreciate your time, and you have the floor.
All right. Good morning, or actually, good afternoon, everybody. Uh, so yes, we're going to look at and talk about a little bit of prairie restoration, actually reconstructions within Missouri State Parks. So within our state park system, throughout the state, for the past going on almost 40 years, in various particular parks, we've been doing various restoration efforts, recreation efforts, and just basic prairie management. So looking across our park system, um, the background map of the state of Missouri, you can see that just classic mapping of our historic prairies throughout the state. And so many of those state parks that fall within that range, at some point, or we're in either proximity to or we're absolutely dominated by prairie. So this goes everything from Lennowick Village in our extreme northeast corner of the state, down to Prairie State Park on the Kansas border, all the way, of course, then going over to Confluence State Park around St. Louis, and so many areas in between. Some of these are large-scale prairie management and restoration efforts. Others are small little restoration or recreations, prairie recreations that we've had underway. Some are very new, which we're going to get into shortly. Some have been going on for many, many years. Areas such as Prairie State Park, one of our largest prairie settings in the state, while it's just over 4,000 acres of tallgrass prairie, not all areas are and were, when we purchased them, were acquired by the state in good condition. Some were heavily degraded prairies. Others were areas that ultimately, we had to do a lot of work to restore or even just go in and do initial seeding on some areas. But the vast majority of Prairie State Park, of course, was still intact prairie. That's quite different from some of these other areas, such as Arrow Rock, Van Meter, Lewis and Clark, so many of our other state parks that unfortunately they had prairie components in and around those parks, but all notions of prairie have been wiped from the landscape. So in that case, since we had nothing to start with, no remnants remaining, ultimately those are reconstructions, and so we have a lot of those, and those range in size from fractions of an acre to hundreds of acres. So thinking about places such as Long Branch, where we had good remnants, but then had a lot of other lands that ultimately we wanted to turn back into a tall grass prairie setting, where we've done some larger restorations or reconstructions over the years. Specifically today, we're looking at some areas in Saline County. So based around Arrow Rock State Historic Site, the community of Arrow Rock, and other portions of Saline County. We have two projects going on, one at Arrow Rock, the other one at Van Meter State Park, so just roughly 20 minutes northwest of the community of Arrow Rock. And so with these areas, over the past 5 years, we've really started working, to recreate some of those prairies that once existed. The picture you're looking at is a George Catlin painting from 1832. His description of this area was roughly 110 miles from St. Louis. As far as river miles, that would actually put it over more in the Boone County region, or even to the east of Boone County. So we're really not sure truly where he was on the river, but we believe it was truly somewhere within Missouri. And so this was kind of his depiction of what these hillsides, and so many in the Saline County area being less hills, looked like when he passed through in 1832. As far as Saline County itself, wonderful county that historically was a dominant prairie county. One of the great little passages out of the History of Saline County book from 1881 is the general surface of the county is that of high rolling prairie with high bluffs and rich bottoms bordering the streams. And so while that's a great note, and there are other wonderful notes that describe areas such as the Teetsaw Plains, within Saline County. That's all we have today, really, within Saline County. Are these notes of what the county was like. We really don't have any large prairie remnants left. No large intact prairies still exist in Saline County. There are a number of restoration efforts, some other minor and kind of smaller prairie management areas, but none of the large landscape prairies that once existed in Saline County are there. So what we looked at doing at these two particular Missouri State Park and historic sites was to put back into those lands a component of prairie. So at Arrow Rock State Historic Site, we had, this shows you some of the maps of pre-settlement prairie. We've got two different versions of what prairie maps were. One by the Schroeder map, the other one the Harlan map. Ultimately, they're very similar, but they use a little bit different data in defining where those prairie areas were. So you can see the boundary of Arrow Rock State Historic Site on the left side of the screen. It's just a small little inclusion of prairie up in that southern boundary. For the Harlan map, you see that much of that community, as far as our historic site, they have it noted as being prairie there. So a little bit different mapping, and that's all based on some of the GLO notes, topographic features, and just lay of the land or soils. So when we look a little bit more closely using that Harlan map, and then we overlay some of these fields at Arrow Rock State Historic Site, they fall right in this zone that we wanted to initiate some prairie reconstructions. In Missouri State Parks, our philosophy isn't you can create prairie everywhere. It is prairie, of course, is best suited to where it historically was. To go in a historic woodland that had been cleared and attempt to create a prairie, you may get a lot of components of prairie that look fantastic. But our concept, rather than trying to force a community that historically wasn't there, was to put it, whatever natural community was there, back into its place. And with Arrow Rock, we chose the Harlan map, and we have old fields that were pretty much early agricultural fields or domestic hay production fields and grazing fields at Arrow Rock that we wanted to turn those into something more worthwhile, not only for the community and our historic site, but also all of our native organisms that live in and around this community or pass through. So with this particular property, and there is an aerial view of Arrow Rock State Historic Site. So those of you that are on site, you're probably somewhere on that map. Those of you joining us via the web, Ethan and others are not far away on that site, but you see those areas of the park that are somewhat semi-transparent yellow. Those are fields that we looked at prairie reconstruction over the past few years. So within this, it's approximately 38 acres between all of these different fields. We were assisted with Missouri Bird Conservation Initiative grant in 2018 to really kickstart this. And so with that grant, we utilized those funds to assist us in seed purchasing for these properties. In addition to the seed we were able to purchase, we also did a lot of hand collecting of seed from both our local state parks and historic sites, as well as some Missouri Department of Conservation lands and other roadsides where we had good populations, because we wanted to have as close to source material as possible. As I mentioned earlier, that so much of the historic prairies that existed in Saline County are no longer there. It was quite difficult to find immediate region and county populations of these plants that we wanted. So we kind of had to extend our boundaries and borders of collection areas out further than Saline County. But between the seeds we purchased from Pure Air natives and those which myself and others hand collected, we put down a good amount of seed in the early spring of 2020. So right now that site, we were hoping to get it burned this late winter and spring. We didn't have conducive weather for that and staffing at the time, unfortunately. But right now, it's a lot of just existing weeds out there, still some of the remnant pasture and forage plants that are still out there. But we should expect to start seeing some of those forbs, as well as our grasses that we're planting, start coming up, and we'll start seeing those and working within the management of removing some of the other exotics that didn't spray out in our first two rounds. But they're also reintroducing other seeds as we move along. It's not a seed one-time process and done. It's constantly adding new seeds to that just so that we build up the overall richness of that site to make it more of a, a full prairie rather than a 20 species prairie. We want to keep building that up over time, just so it is much more reminiscent of the prairies that existed at that site and in the region. So that is one of the right there on the ground most recent prairie reconstructions that we have within our state park system. Another one that started a few years prior, still in Saline County, is over at Van Meter State Park. Van Meter, for those of you who have visited, been around, and explored a lot of Van Meter, just like any of our parks and historic sites within Missouri, it's a phenomenal state park with a lot of history, both cultural history and ecological natural resource history to it, between our marshes, our kind of mesic slopes and forested valleys. And at that site, we had a lot of old fields that had either been under hay production for years or had been under agricultural production for years. So we mapped these out and started thinking about doing some prairie restoration on these areas, because historically on these lusk bluffs, that prairie went either up to the bluffs or just behind the bluffs, as well as also was included as wet prairies down in these bottomlands of the Missouri River floodplain. So at Arrow Rock, we had 4 sites designated. At this time, Site 1, which is at the bottom, the southeast corner of the park, that's the only one we've initiated thus far. We wanted to kickstart that, get it well going, and make sure that things were fairly well to the conditions we wanted before we really started branching out and moving into these other units. So in 2016, we initiated that by burning off all of the old ag grasses that were there, the fescue and brome that was there. And so following prescribed burn of that Site 1 unit, which is roughly 70 acres, we did a very light disking just to crack that soil so that we'd have better seed penetration. And then we started seeding. And all of that seed for Site 1 came from hand collection seeds, as well as some seeds were collected using a flail vac at Long Branch or Pershing State Park for our grasses. But all of the fords were all hand collected, as well as a lot of our sedges and rushes. And ultimately, over on the side, you really can't see it very well because it is small, but that Excel file is a portion of the species that have been planted at Van Meter. So we've broken over 100 species that have been planted at that site. Of course, some in mass quantity, some of those larger late summer, late fall composites, then some in minor quantities, all depending on where we're able to find that seed in a sizable population enough to be able to collect seed. But, roughly 105 species or so have been seeded there. And our concept with it was to get started. We didn't have, hundreds and hundreds of pounds of seed. So our first seeding, we tried to cover as much area as we could to at least get some of those plants started, knowing that they're going to help fill in the gaps over time. Every year since then, we've collected seed, and we'll go to different portions of that Zone 1 or Site 1 and heavily reseed on much smaller areas. So after the initial seeding, the next year we did another prescribed burn in the dormant season, and that was followed by a seeding of the the western side. Then we reseeded after another prescribed burn on the northern side. We conducted a prescribed burn in a very early March of this year, and then reseeded heavily over the eastern side of Site 1. And things are really starting to look good out there in this 5th year. Grasses, of course, came up fairly quickly, but some of those forbs, you could see them basally, or the rosettes of them, within all of the grass. But as far as getting those to flower, it takes a few years as they really have to work on creating and building up that root stock before they're large enough and sizable enough to start producing flowering stalks. But last year we started seeing a lot of liatris, a lot of our compass plant, or not compass plant, pardon me, but compass plant and other silphiums. And so we started, especially last year, seeing a lot more forbs coming up. So we only expect to see that more and more. After, it'll still be a few years on Site 1 when we really feel that we can step away from it, that we've got a lot of plants there, they're all doing well. Then we'll start moving to Sites 2, 3, and 4 in future years. Just a few pictures of what that Site 1 looked like. Originally, although it had been in agricultural production before it was purchased by Missouri State Parks, This particular site is a component of the Oots archaeological site. So of Van Meter and its cultural significance, this was a major village site, so it has a lot of archaeological significance. They've been surveyed by MU archaeologists years past. They actually had an archaeology school based at the edge of Van Meter, where they did a lot of surveying every summer throughout this region. So that property, when we had purchased it, had been in agricultural production. It was planted simply in fescue and other forage grasses just for stabilization coming out of row crops. In state parks, we do have some areas that are hay, but ultimately haying and maintaining hay fields, is not our business. So we wanted to finally get into, that prairie reconstruction. And you can see that picture in the top left that wasn't a prime fescue field. It had a lot of weedier forbs and prairie forbs within it. So we weren't having to do a mass spraying of that site just to remove all of the fescue. We still have fescue out there. It's decreasing in its overall abundance through our prescribed burns, but still we do have to take care of it through some herbicide use. But a lot of tall goldenrod, a few different species of asters were quite abundant out there. So because we had some of the weedier prairie forbs or some living forbs, we didn't want to just blast it with herbicide and set it back to ground zero. So that first picture shows you what it was like when we decided to initiate prairie reconstruction. The second picture is after our first prescribed burn. Third picture is after that initial just minor disking following the prescribed burn to crack that soil so that we would have good seed and soil contact. And then you start seeing some of the vegetation recovery after one of our prescribed burns on that picture on the bottom right. So of the two restoration sites that we currently have in Saline County, if you want to get out and explore and kind of see the progress of how things are going, Van Meter is going to be the place to go currently because you will see a lot more of these prairie grasses and forbs throughout that zone. Within it, we already had good prairie organisms in the region between northern harriers, short-eared owls, quail, and others, but we are seeing a lot more usage by especially birds, just as a general, not through survey work, of this region. Ethan and his team, they can tell you more about that in another time of the bird usage of that site. They did some earlier survey work just as we were getting started, and they also get out there to enjoy that site. Some things to consider within this, at least from my perspective. These prairies, not only did they not just develop overnight, it was through a lot of geological and climatic processes that when we look at these reconstructions and even restorations of damaged sites, they're long-term projects. It's not a one and done type item where you can just throw some seed down and walk away and expect to have something that is reminiscent of a prairie in all aspects. So there are these things that are the labors of love. Doesn't matter the size of it, if it's in your backyard and it's in a 2 foot by 2 foot square, or if it's in, has many acres. These are labors of love that you spend time just constantly managing, trying to remove weedy species or exotic species, and continually introducing new species just to build out that overall floristic richness of the site. We still do, as I mentioned earlier, do annual introductions of other localized native prairie seeds. That's because prairies are diverse systems, and throwing out a single seed mix or the single collections of a given year is not, the largest expression of prairie. And I want to see the largest expression that we can possibly manage between our basic prairie grasses, between just an absolute massive plethora of forbs that start off with the earliest, late winter, early spring flowering species, a lot of the sedges, which get missed out in a lot of basic seeding operations, to be able to constantly put these things in so that they are components, and hopefully in time that they fill in all of the gaps and kind of spread throughout the zones that they're best suited for at these particular sites. And this is my concept that, we can't build prairies, but we work towards that expression. Prairies between the abiotic components, between soil components, between just the floristic assemblages and how they've sorted themselves out over vast amounts of time into those proper placements or best suited placements. We can't just recreate that overnight or even over years, but we can create what is an absolutely exceptional expression of prairie, and hope that for our grandkids and their children, that they see something that is as close as we can create to a prairie in that landscape. There will always be small items that are missing between particular species, soil microbes, but if we can get the dominant players in, both floristically and with our fauna of birds. Unfortunately, large mammal introduction of bison can't happen everywhere, but getting a lot of those other mammals and other organisms to utilize these sites, you really get closer to that true prairie. It's that good expression. And for me, it's also a field of dreams philosophy. I think it is for all of us. If you build it, they'll come. So between birds, between pollinating insects, to give them that place and that space allows them opportunity to come in. If they're still present within our landscape, they will make their way there at some point. So it's just sitting back and getting to enjoy these things as they arrive, and documenting those and waiting for others to come in. So that kind of, unfortunately, like I said, didn't have much time. 15 minutes. I went over. I apologize. I just now looked at the clock. A lot of people to be thanked for these projects. This isn't some individual item I took on. It took a lot of Missouri State Park staff to collect seed, to get these units ready and prepped for the seeding operations, our prescribed burns, logistical operations. So between our staff, MOBC, MRBO staff, and then others, I'd like to thank all of them for their time and energy in helping us bring these things about, and look forward to further cooperation, so that in the end of our careers, we can look at these areas and see the product and be where we want to be with these. So if we have time for any questions, Ethan, I'll be happy to answer any questions if there may be some.
Great. I failed to mention it at the beginning. Anybody can type in questions or things in the chat if you have any questions there. I can handle those, and we can address them. Chris, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for Missouri DNR and state parks, because it's just a beautiful intersection between their goals and their vision and their mission of especially through state parks of providing these cultural opportunities, as well as a mixture of looking at healthy natural communities and serving the overall public good through those ecosystem services. And I just think it's a great testament to the agency for taking on these endeavors, and also bringing in all members of the community as stakeholders to participate and eventually enjoy it. I know that we're not very long into the arrow rock restoration, but we can already see certain species that are benefiting, at least not by, at least with the lack of haying that's going on. A lot of nests, we watch stick thistles and eastern meadowlarks every year. Their nests just got bound up, and the hay operation, and also the monarch butterflies, right when they're ready to emerge. Then came the hay operation. So there's already just almost immeasurable benefit by just changing land use practice, let alone the diversity that you're adding in here. So it's fun to see it from the very beginnings of sort of reconstruction, to see what happens there. I'm not seeing any questions that pop up yet, but I do have one for you. Looking at those old pre-settlement maps, which are so fascinating and give us such a good insight of kind of what should be there. And you added that other additional map in there after Schoolcraft, and it was the I forget what you called that, the Harlan map. And so on the Harlan map, how much of that area and that edge was savanna? With those that don't know, savanna is kind of a prairie with trees. It's 20% or less canopy cover. But how much of that was a gradation in there of that?
That's a great question that I can't answer. Actually, I had to talk to Mike Leahy a few years ago about, what are these differences between these two, and how was that data gathered? As I mentioned, Some of it's, of course, basic GLO notes, which we always wish our GLO surveyors of the 1800s took a little bit more time to write some of their notes so we had a better understanding of truly what was there. But they at least gave us a broad picture that we can make some general interpretations from. But Ethan, that's a good question. I can't tell you kind of where that gradation zone was. You expected that one existed. Wasn't a hard edge between woodlands and prairies.
Exactly.
Mid zone, which are fantastic areas in themselves, but they don't fall well into those GLO notes of, okay, here's where the woodlands are and usable timber by the surveyor's notes, to large prairie, and then you had shrublands or scrublands that they noted, which you always wondered, were these just brushier prairies, kind of that boundary area where you start getting into some woodier vegetation, getting close to woodlands. I always wonder exactly what those were.
It's just a neat component. I like seeing the gradation there. Where is it? St. Joe State Park has got some great examples of that. You have some beautiful forest components and beautiful natural community types that are in the forest group. And then underneath the understory, you have all these kind of grassland natural community types kind of seeping up through. And I just think it's a beautiful combination. And I imagine historically where there were trees in Arrow Rock, at least kind of west in there's probably a similar kind of makeup historically. But thank you very much.
On my Missouri State Park map, I didn't show some of those in the further in the Ozark region, but we do have, down throughout the Ozarks, a lot of prairie portions, and St. Joe is one of those. St. Joe and even St. Francis State Park, where there were small prairie components, and they weren't just these little half-acre areas. They were even larger than that, and they didn't get on this map, but they do exist. We've been managing those. Some of them we've even recently found, just kind of, they've always been there, just weren't in areas that we were doing some of our other work. But St. Joe, especially, a lot of woodland restoration. They're trying to open those up from those closed woodland settings of our contemporary woodlands, and working on woodland restoration to really open those things up so it gets more into that very open woodland, coming out of either be it glade settings or large prairie settings into an open woodland setting. So I'm glad you've been able to notice that at St. Joe, Ethan.
Yeah, beautiful. I've got one comment here, no questions. Somebody says, awesome presentation, great information. So just a note for everybody, these are recorded and they will be posted, so you'll be able to view them from the app later on and talk with your other fellow registrants about them. But thanks again for your time and all that you've done, the thoughtful work you have done for stewardship in Missouri. We really appreciate it. The birds and the pollinators really appreciate it. So we look forward to working with you in the future too, Chris.
You all as well. I appreciate it, and thank you. And one last note, although such as the area at Van Meter and Arrow Rock, we don't have trails through those areas, as they become very well established prairie restorations or reconstructions, we do look at putting mild, smaller trail systems through some of these, so that the general public can easily get out there without having to wade through the thick big blue, little blue, and Indian grass. So look for that in the future, that while we're doing these reconstructions, we still want to make it easily accessible for all of our visitors so that you can get out there and enjoy it, but don't have to wade through the thick prairie vegetation. Some of us enjoy that, others not so much, but we want everybody to be able to enjoy it all the same.
That would be great. It's a heck of a tick year this year, but I just can't wait. I just can envision seeing members of the general public and school groups, kids in the Arrow Rock area, especially, being able to get out there and see something they haven't been able to see on their landscape before. At least, it's going to be a great opportunity.
Well, Ethan, I thank you and all of your team for inviting me and for your assistance. And yeah, thank you very much.
Bye.